Good to see you. Ironically, I'm going to be teaching on anxiety today, and I'm feeling a little anxious about this second message because in the first service, I butchered this story. So I'm going to give it another shot here, but I'm feeling a little bit of anxiety about it, so if you can pray for me about it. But there was an anxious fisherman up on the northeast off the New England coast, and he was out with his crew, and they encountered some really fierce storms, and so the waves were really, really high, and so he was a little freaked out about it, and everybody's working to make sure they keep the ship afloat and everything going the right way. And as he's fighting this storm, he remembers that right before he left, his wife had told him, hey, don't forget to sign the life insurance papers. And so this is where earlier the story went really bad. So just pray, especially for this part. I want to make sure I get this right, because I do not want to get any details of this made-up story wrong, okay? So anyway, so he leaves his shipmates on the top deck, and he goes down in the cabin, and he got on the computer and got online, and that's the part where I blew it, because everybody's like, how do you get online on a ship? And I figured out between the services, Aquaman was down there, sent a signal through a dolphin, and then that got him some dial-up out there, okay, some old AOL dial-up. And so he gets online, he checks his email, he fills out the paperwork, and it's $500 for $1 million policy. So he makes the payment, he signs the paperwork, feels great. And so he goes back up on the top deck, and the storm continues, but then it dies down. And so, but they look on the horizon, they look in the weather's calling for even more violent storms later. And so the cook decides he's going to make dinner for everybody, and he wants to make the crew's favorite, and so he makes Chinese food. And as a special treat to his crew at the end of the dinner, he gave them all a fortune cookie for dessert. And everything was going well for our poor anxious fisherman until he opened up his fortune cookie, and the fortune read, your recent investment will pay big dividends. All right, that was better. So now I feel a little bit better now. At least I got a laugh. Everybody's like, what happened? And I'm like, I don't know. Aquaman got caught, and he had life insurance. Maybe, maybe not. Who knows what happened? But last week we started a series of messages leading up to Easter. We're calling it Gains and Losses. And the idea is that God calls us to surrender, to give up to Him our lives. And in doing so, we gain everything. So last week we looked at Jesus' teaching in Mark chapter 8 and verse 35 when Jesus told His disciples, for whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake and the gospel's will save it. And we made the point that when you lose your life to Christ, you gain everything. You lose it by giving it up to Him, and in return, you gain everything. Today I want to continue with this idea, but I want us to turn to Luke chapter 12. And I'm going to talk to you about a subject today that admittedly is a lot easier for me to preach about than it is for me to live it out in my own life. But we're going to talk about anxiety. And in this passage that we're going to study, Jesus is actually going to call us to lose our anxiety, to give it up. Now, I'm not going to ask for a show of hands because that alone would make us anxious. But if I went around the room and said, how many of you struggle with anxiety? Most of us would raise our hand. We're all on that struggle bus together, right? We struggle with anxiety and worry that's rooted sometimes in fear. But in Luke chapter 12, we're going to study verses 22 through 34. But to begin, I just want to read one verse, verse 22. And Jesus said to His disciples, therefore I tell you, do not be anxious about your life, what you will eat, nor about your body, what you will put on. Now, stop there for a moment. I want us to look, and first of all, in verse 22, Jesus is speaking to His disciples. And that's going to be important when we study the rest of the chapter together. But Jesus makes this nice, seemingly easy statement. Are you ready for it? Hey, don't be anxious about your life. Now, have you ever felt a certain way and you express those feelings to someone and they disagree with your feelings and then they tell you, well, you shouldn't feel that way? Has that ever happened? Husbands, I don't recommend it, just to let you know. Not from experience, I just want you to know that. But it's easy to just say, well, you shouldn't feel that way. Well, it is how I feel, you know. And Jesus tells us in this verse, don't be anxious about your life. But if you have anxiety in your life about anything, do you feel that tension? Jesus is saying, don't be anxious, and yet you're saying, but it is what I feel. I am a worrier. There are times in my life where I have felt anxiety about a number of different things. And so Jesus makes what seems to be a simple statement, but it's not an easy statement. Ironically, Forbes magazine, I say ironically because Forbes magazine is known for talking about the wealth of people, and Forbes magazine is always a reminder that there are haves and have-nots, and you're not on the list of haves at this point in your life. You know what I'm talking about? But in their October article, they released an article in October of this last year about anxiety disorders. And I'm going to read a couple statistics. Over 40 million adults, 19.1% of the population, have an anxiety disorder in the U.S., which is not just feelings of anxiety, but actually a disorder that needs to be treated medically or through therapy. That's 20%. So looking around this room today, pastorally speaking, we got about 1,000 people in here. So that would mean that about 190 of you would deal with anxiety. So a fifth of people actually have anxiety disorders. The U.S. Census Bureau released this. Nearly one-third of adults, 32.3%, reported anxiety and depression symptoms in 2023. So maybe not having a disorder that needs to be treated in a certain way, but that means a third of Americans, maybe a third of the people in this room today, have felt symptoms of anxiety or depression. It's the reality for us. And yet, in verse 22, Jesus says, don't be anxious about your life. He's telling us, lose the anxiety. Don't be anxious about your life. But I want you to look there in verse 22. As Jesus is speaking, he says something at the beginning of his talk here. He says, therefore I tell you. Now the you there is just the disciples, just the 12 who are following him. But that word therefore combines what Jesus is about to say to his disciples with what has previously been discussed in this chapter. So I want us to look back and begin in verse 13 to kind of get the context of what Jesus is teaching. Someone in the crowd said to him, teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me. Now, if you look back to verse 1 of chapter 12, you'll see that there are thousands of people in this crowd. And they are there to listen to Jesus, to see his work. And from the crowd, a man speaks up and he says, Jesus, I want you to tell my brother to stop being selfish and greedy with the inheritance and to divide it with me. Now, I've added some extra words here in my summary, but you're going to see in what Jesus teaches related to that that's exactly what's happening. Notice in verse 14, Jesus' response. But he said to him, now he's saying this directly to the man, man, who made me a judge or arbitrator over you? In essence, Jesus is saying, why are you bringing this to me? There are courts that can handle this kind of stuff, the affairs between people. But then notice in verse 15, and he said to them. Now this is no longer him. This is to the crowd of people that are gathered. He's actually going to use what this man has asked Jesus to teach a spiritual truth. And he tells him in verse 14, take care and be on guard against all covetousness, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions. Now, verse 15 actually should be a liberating verse for you. If I went on Google this week to Google, how do you measure success? Just that simple statement. The first article that came up was from LinkedIn. Now, if you don't know what LinkedIn is, it's essentially a business website where people can put their profile up, and sometimes people will look there for people looking in a certain field of work. So it's a way to make connections in the business world. The first article that came up was from them, and the first line, or maybe the second line of the article, here's a quote. Wealth, job title, and happiness are some of the most common measures of success. Now, to read the rest of the article, to be fair to that quote, they actually in the article tell people and express that those should not be the only metrics by which we measure success, but the phrasing here is important. It's the most common measure of success. How much money you have, the title and of power and authority that you have, and then your happiness. But I want you to hear what Jesus is going to communicate throughout this passage and then in the following conversation. Your life's value is not measured by what you have. Your life's value is not measured in the eyes of God by what you have. I remember vividly in 1988 going on my first mission trip. I was 11 years old, about to turn 12. and we went down to Mexico. Now, back in the day in the Christian world, it was a really common thing for everybody to have a Bible cover. You remember those days? Right? And so it started just kind of put a cover on your Bible, but then, marketing got a hold of it, and so they made these really intricate Bible covers, and then your grandparents got a hold of it, and then at Christmas time, you got a crocheted Bible cover. You know what I'm talking about? And you knew everybody in the church was judging you when you had that. It's like, yeah, I know you love your granny, but that's not good looking. You know what I mean? And I remember as a kid, it was kind of in the middle of that day, going down into Mexico and ministering to the people there. And I, for the first time in my life, saw poverty. And it was unlike anything I had ever seen in my entire life. We walked into homes where there was a woman sweeping her floor to prepare for guests to come in, and the floor was dirt. It wasn't like she was sweeping dirt off of the wood or the tile. She was sweeping the dirt in patterns so that it looked really nice for her guests coming in. I saw people rummage through the city dump, and they would find things in there and bring it home, and they would clean it up. And sometimes they would use it for cooking utensils. They would use it for decor in their homes. But I remember one night when we were there at the mission that this woman came, and I saw them, coming. They were all walking to church because none of them had vehicles. They were walking to church from the local communities, and this woman's coming up, and I noticed that the cover of her Bible is red. And the edges of it, you could see it as she got closer, they were really tattered, really well worn. And then I looked at her Bible, and she had covered her Bible with a Dorito bag. That was her Bible cover. She had pulled it out of the trash, cut it, and then cleaned off the inside of it. But from the first time this woman spoke to me as an 11-year-old kid, I knew that this woman walked with Jesus. And this woman loved the Lord, and she loved His Word. And I remember standing there at the door of that mission church, and as a kid, I couldn't quite put the words to it, but what I was shown in that moment was that this woman's life and her faith mattered to God. You see, because your life is not measured by the abundance of your possessions. It's not like God looks down from heaven and He says, oh, you've got a 2,800 square foot house. I value you more than the woman who walks to church in Mexico with her Bible covered with a Dorito bag. Because your life's value is not measured by what's in your bank account or the square footage of your home. God doesn't look at your boat and your car, and He values you more with the abundance of things that you accumulate. So that should set you free today. That the abundance of stuff is not how God values and measures your life. Your value is not measured in dollars and cents, designer jeans, bigger houses, newer cars, leather seats over cloth seats. Your life is not valued by the things that you have. And then in verse 16, Jesus illustrated what He had just said with a story. So let's listen to the story in verse 16. He told them a parable saying, the land of a rich man produced plentifully. And he thought to himself, what shall I do? For I have nowhere to store my crops. And he said, I will do this. I will tear down my barns and build larger ones. And there I will store all my grain and my goods. And I will say to my soul, and this saying here it could be like the theme or the slogan of what the American dream has become. I will say to my soul, soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, be merry. But God said to him, fool, this night your soul is required of you, and the things that you have prepared, whose will they be? So is the one who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God. There was a wealthy man who was once asked, how much money are you going to leave to your kids and to your family? And his response was, all of it. Because the truth is that when this life ends, we don't take anything with us. We don't take anything to eternity except for those that we have shared Christ with. And what Jesus is saying to us here is stop worrying about accumulating more stuff. Stop making that the pursuit and the dream of your life. And start in verse 21 being rich toward God. Start building God's kingdom. Your life's value is not measured by what you have, rather who has you. You're a child of God. And that's where your value is found. And so from that story that Jesus told in response to one man's question out of the large crowd that had assembled there, verse 22, Jesus doesn't speak to the crowd and he doesn't speak to the man. Verse 22, he speaks to his disciples. And he tells them, I tell you, do not be anxious about your life, what you will eat, nor about your body, what you will put on. For life is more than food, and the body more than clothing. Consider the ravens. They neither sow nor reap. They have neither storehouse nor barn, and yet God feeds them. Of how much more value are you than the birds? Now, verse 22, Jesus uses the word anxious. It's actually a Greek word that means to be ripped apart. And I thought about it this week about how I could illustrate ripping things apart, and I thought, well, I'll just tear my shirt off in front of the whole church. And I thought that would close down the church forever, you know? So I said, let's not rip your clothing off, right? Don't go Hulk Hogan in his heyday, you know, but that's the idea. It's taking a piece of cloth and pulling it to the point that it rips apart. And that's the word that Jesus used when he talks about anxiety. Don't let your life, don't be ripped apart about your life. And isn't that exactly what anxiety feels like to you? Like there's something inside of you that's pulling and you feel like things are tearing and ripping. And Jesus says, don't be anxious about your life. Don't be torn apart about your life. And he goes on to say, life is not about the food and the clothing you put on. So stop talking to your pastor about his shirt colors. Amen? Y'all get the application today? That's what it was, right? But in verse 23, he speaks specifically about two things, food and clothing. Now, if you ever have the opportunity to vacation with my mom, and I love my mom dearly, and she is the absolute best mom, but my mom's gift is definitely hospitality. So, any old school fans of the show Everybody Loves Raymond, in our family, my mom is Marie and Leslie is Deborah, okay? Come in, you know, the judgmental glance like, are you taking care of my husband? You know, that kind of thing. If you've ever seen the show, it's amazing. But if you go vacation with my mom, we went last year to Florida with my family. And if my mom had her way, she would prepare every meal for everybody every single day because that's just who she is. She loves to do it. So we go visit her in the country, and she'll say, I'm just going to make y'all a big country breakfast in the morning, and that's what we know is coming. And by big country breakfast, what she means is tonight, call the National Guard in because there's going to be enough food for all of them. We get up in the morning, and it's like she has cooked not just specific things for the kids that they like. One kid's like cinnamon roll. One likes, chocolate pancakes. I mean, she will make not only that specific thing for that kid. So I might have one kid that likes cinnamon rolls, but she makes enough cinnamon rolls for everybody. I got one kid that likes chocolate chip pancakes. She makes enough of those for everybody. And then there's bacon. And then I'll tell her, Mom, how many people are you expecting? Like, is somebody coming? She's like, well, we'll eat on some of it later. You know what I mean? And we do. It's like we're grazing all day long, just walking by, just picking up more food and walking along. But I shared with you last week the story of my friend Mary Lamb. Remember, she's the lady that got upset because the girl fell down between first and second, and my dad told my sister, tag her out before we check on the injury. Y'all remember that heartless story that I shared last week? Well, Mary Lamb went on vacation with my mom and told the story later that they were driving, and they had started early, and they sat down for breakfast. They ate breakfast, and as they were walking out to go to the car to continue their trip, my mom's like, now where do y'all want to stop for lunch? I mean, that's the way my mom is. And Mary's like, Jeanette, we're going to do other things other than eat on this trip. You know what I'm saying? Like, it's not all about that. And Jesus in this is reminding us that life is more than just the food that you eat and the clothing that you put on your back. And in verse 24, we get some insight exactly into what Jesus is saying. Consider the ravens. They neither sow nor reap. They have neither storehouse nor barn. Now remember earlier, Jesus in response to that man tells the story, the parable of the man who has plenty. And he says, I'm going to tear down my old barns and I'm going to build bigger ones. And so Jesus said, if you want to know what this is really about, think about the birds. They don't have a barn. They don't have storehouses. But notice what he says, and yet God feeds them. God meets every single one of their needs. But then there's this beautiful statement of how much more value are you than the birds. And I don't want to be too, kind of out there on this, but Jesus is using a very vivid illustration for us that every time you see a bird, it can be a reminder that God will meet your needs. Just think about the birds, how they are taken care of, and God values you so much more than these. That's because your life's value is not measured by what you have, rather who has you. I had the unfortunate opportunity this week to see a segment of Good Morning America. Yeah, I know. I don't care about the politics, not going to argue about it in here. It's just an annoying show, honestly. But I was so glad I saw this segment because since Christmas of last year, I've hardly been able to sleep because no one has seen Kate Middleton. But this week, she was spotted in public. And they caught a picture of it and showed it to me. I think it was Thursday morning. And I want to apologize for the graininess. That's the best I could find. And listen, the paparazzi, they're doing the best they can, y'all. Okay, so don't be super judgmental about it. But she was finally seen out in public this week. She has not been seen since Christmas Day, and I've been worried sick. And apparently she had surgery, but she's not doing anything, just to let y'all know, she's not doing anything else public until after Easter, all right? So now you can rest and not be anxious about that. But you remember when they had their kids, their first kid, and it was back in 2013, and there's an obsession that people have with Kate Middleton and Prince William's kids. And they are, by the way, super cute kids. But remember when they had the kid, it was at St. Mary's Hospital, and there were hundreds and hundreds of reporters on this side road beside the hospital waiting by the door for them to introduce their child to the world. And I'm not kidding you. When they brought that kid out, people in the crowd were crying, men and women. Like, I was sitting there thinking, what is up with our obsession with their kids? When we adopted Ellie in China, when we went there, it's very rare in China for them to see American children. They see American businessmen all the time. Everywhere we went, people would gather around us and film us because we had our kids with us. And then when we would look over at them, they would turn their phone away like they weren't doing. I'm like, bro, I just saw you filming my kid. Like, it's so weird. But like, we're obsessed with their kids. And they're super beautiful kids, and I don't think you should be obsessed with them, but George was born on July 22nd, 2013. He was 8 pounds. No, just kidding. I'm not going to give you all that information. But I remember that day when I was watching, it kind of sparked in my mind, like, how do they earn a living? Like, what is the whole king and royal family? So I kind of looked it up, and I found this all online, so it's all true. But I was sitting there thinking about their lives as children born into royalty. There's not going to be a day of their lives where they're going to be in need. Do you know why? Because of who their father is. And for you as a child of God, I want you to know that when you look at the birds and you see how God takes care of them, Jesus is saying to you, I've got you. You're my child. And if I take care of those birds, I value you so much more. So why are you worrying about these things? So in verse 24, we actually discover what Jesus is saying. How can we lose anxiety? I want to share, first of all, trust God. Trust God. Notice in verse 25 as Jesus continues, and which of you by being anxious, there's that word again, being ripped apart, can add a single hour to his span of life? If you then are not able to do a small thing as that, why are you anxious about the rest? There was a grandfather that was watching football with his grandson. The grandfather was in his 80s. And so they were just talking in the commercial break, and he said, it's not easy getting old. And I guess in my life, I'm in the fourth quarter of my life, and without hesitation, the little boy looked up and said, don't worry, Grandpa, maybe you'll go into overtime. I mean, what can worry do for you? What can worry do for you? And the answer is nothing good. A husband talked to his wife, and he said, why are you always worrying about everything when in the end it doesn't do any good. And she said, oh, it does good. Over 90% of the things I worry about never happen. And isn't that true when you get on the other side of a season? You look back and you say, and you see how God worked in all those circumstances to bring you where you were. And have you ever said, I don't know why I was so worried about that? But when you're in the midst of it, it's in those moments that we feel like we're not trusting God or we can't trust Him. In verse 26, don't skip that question. If by worrying you can't do a small thing, which is actually a large thing for us, to add an extra hour to your life, why are you worrying about all the rest? Why are you not trusting God that He's in control? You see, you're not in control, but the one who has you is. He's in control. And for many of us, I think the anxiety comes when things feel like they are beyond our control. If you look down to verse 27, Jesus continues, consider the lilies, how they grow. They neither toil nor spin, yet I tell you, even Solomon in all his glory was not arrayed like one of these. But if God so clothes the grass, which is alive in the field today and tomorrow is thrown into the oven, how much more will He clothe you, O you of little faith? Now that statement is hard, isn't it? It had been hard for the disciples to hear that. To say that our anxiety is directly tied to our faith. And we're not trusting God in those moments. But think about all the encounters that the disciples had when their faith was wavering. They're at sea and there's a great storm and they go down to Jesus and they tell Him, Lord, we're perishing. And Jesus arises and He says, why are you afraid, O you of little faith? Then He arose and rebuked the winds and the sea, and there was a great calm. Don't you think the disciples are standing there on the deck as the sea goes calm, and later they're like, I don't know why we worried about that. Can't you imagine that in their mind? Or remember in Matthew chapter 14, Peter got out of the boat and he's walking on the water, and then he starts to look at the waves, and he begins to lose faith and sinks, and then he cries out to Jesus. And then Peter is told by Jesus, oh, you of little faith, why did you doubt? In Matthew chapter 16, the disciples were worried because they didn't have enough bread. And He told them, oh, you of little faith, why are you discussing among yourselves the fact that you have no bread? Do you not perceive, do you not remember the 5 loaves for the 5,000 and how many baskets you gathered? He reminds them, don't you remember what I did with that little boy's lunch? And you're worried that we don't have bread today? I fed 5,000 people and we had 12 baskets full of fragments. Don't worry about it. I've got you. You can trust me in the midst of this. For me, more than anything else, my persistent worrying, when I find myself in seasons of doubt and worry, it's directly tied to my faith in God. And what I have found is in those seasons where my faith in God is great, my anxiety and worry goes down. But when my faith in God is hurting and it's low, that's when my anxiety goes through the roof. And it's like the little boy that's walking with his dad, and they're walking down the road and they're holding hands. And the boy looks up to his dad and he says, Dad, hold my hand. And he looks down and their hands are connected. And he said, I am holding your hands. He said, no, I'm holding yours, but you're not holding mine. And what the little boy could feel in that moment was he was holding on to his dad's hand, but the dad wasn't pulling tight. And the dad pulled tight so that the kid would know, I've got you. You see, when it comes to God, there's never a moment when we look up to God and say, God, we need you to hold us in this. We need you to be with us through this, because He is always there. He's always holding your hand, even in the midst of the times when it doesn't feel that way. God's got you. So one of the cures for anxiety is to trust God. But listen, faith is not the assurance that everything is going to go smoothly. You need to hear that. You can't just say, name it and claim it, I'm going to have faith in God and everything in my life is going to be easy. That is not biblical. It's not a true teaching from Scripture. Jesus said, in the world you'll have tribulation. In other words, in the world you're going to be on a boat and there's going to be storms, but be of good cheer, I've overcome the world. So faith is not the assurance that everything is going to go smoothly, but faith is the firm assurance God's got me. The God I serve is able to save me from the fire, but if He doesn't, He's still got me. The God that I serve is able to provide, but even if I have to struggle through this, God's got me. And then there's this turning point. Jesus is telling them, trust God. But notice in verse 29, and do not seek what you are to eat and what you're to drink, nor be worried. For all the nations of the world seek after these things, and your Father knows that you need them. I think for me, I found that my anxiety oftentimes is tied to what I'm seeking. In verse 30, Jesus tells his disciples, by seeking to accumulate all these things, by seeking all these things that are in the world, then you are seeking exactly like the rest of the world who does not have me as their Father. There's no difference. But I want to focus in verse 30 on just 3 words. Your Father knows. When you're in financial trouble, your Father knows. When you're feeling anxiety, your Father knows. When you're struggling with depression, your Father knows. When you feel overwhelmed with fear, your Father knows. When you've lost something or someone and the hurt inside is so great, your Father knows. When you're falling behind on your mortgage because you can't find a job, your Father knows. When you've got a great job or you've lost a job, your Father knows. He knows everything you need before you ask it. And that should tell us something about prayer. That oftentimes the way we treat prayer is our Luby's cafeteria list. I want this, this, and this, and leave that off. But what prayer is us reaching up to God and holding on to His hand. And saying, no matter what I walk through, as long as you're with me, I can walk through it. And that's where our anxiety begins to fade into the background. I want you to write those 3 words down somewhere. My Father knows. He knows how it's all going to turn out. And He knows in the midst of your battle and your storm that He loves you. And He knows that you're going to get through this. And He knows that it hurts. And He knows, though, in the midst of that hurt, that He will never leave you and He will never forsake you. As a dad, I understand that. If you're a parent, you understand what it's like to feel the hurt for and through your children. Because maybe you've walked through that season before, whatever it might be. But when my child hurts, I hurt. I remember in the fire department, I would make calls and, see a broken bone or a wound, and you would take care of that, no problem. But then when one of my kids or my loved ones get injured, all of a sudden it feels different inside of me. Because this is not just a person I show up on a scene to a stranger's house. This is someone that I love and that I care about. And in the midst of those difficult moments, I think we begin to question whether God loves us, whether God cares us, and whether He's with us. But He will never leave you nor forsake you. And He values you infinitely more than He values the birds. And He meets those birds' needs every single day. And He will meet your needs as well. So what Jesus says here is instead of worrying, instead of seeking the world, Jesus says in verse 31 to seek something else. Instead, seek His kingdom, and those things, or these things, will be added to you. So how can we lose anxiety? The first way is to trust God. And second, it's to seek God's kingdom. What is God's kingdom? God's kingdom, if I could define it for you in this way, is this. It's God bringing healing into the world under King Jesus. That's God's kingdom. And that kingdom will reign forever, and of that kingdom there will be no end. And God gives unto His church the keys of the kingdom of heaven. And Jesus is telling His disciples, stop seeking all the things that unbelievers are seeking. People that don't even know me as their Father. And be content with what you've got. And seek God's kingdom. In Matthew's gospel, it's seek first the kingdom of God and His righteousness. And all these things will be added to you. So seek His kingdom. And that's a way to lose our anxiety. Because when we seek the kingdom, we begin to get the focus off of self. And we begin to get it on God's will and God's purpose for our lives. So He says in verse 32, fear not, little flock, for it is your Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom. Often our anxiety is rooted, I believe, in fear. But listen to what Jesus said in the next verse. Sell your possessions and give to the needy. Provide for yourselves with money bags that do not grow old, with a treasure in the heavens that does not fail, where no thief approaches and no moth destroys. For where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. A great principle for your life. I'm not going to preach to the depths of this. But Jesus says in verse 34 that your heart follows your treasure, not the other way around. You know why parents sit at swim team? How many of you are swim parents? Just raise your hand. We need to pray for you. God bless you. I'm telling you. I've served barbecue at these events, and these parents are out under these canopies for like 7 hours so that their kid can swim for 1 minute. And they are just in the sweltering heat. Well, do you know why parents do that? They love their kids, and they've made an investment in their kids, and they're borderline crazy. No, just kidding. I'll leave that off. But they made an investment in it, right? And their heart follows their treasure. They treasure their kids, and they've made an investment. So they say, I'm gonna put the work in here. Jesus didn't say that your treasure follows your heart, but that your heart follows your treasure. Now look back at verses 33 and 34. What does Jesus tell his disciples to do? Sell your possessions and do what with it? Give it to serve others. Give it to the needy. He said, in doing so, you're not acting like the guy that had all the barns and said, let me build bigger barns. They're just going to end up rotting away and not being sufficient. But you'll actually store up and be rich toward God in doing that. So how can we lose anxiety? Trust God, seek his kingdom, and here we see serve others. I'll share with you a story of a lady that dealt with anxiety for many years. She actually had an anxiety disorder, battled depression and anxiety for years. And many times we would have prayer together, we would talk together, we would share together, and we'd try to encourage her in those seasons of kind of dark moments. And I remember one time she called and she said, I'd like to meet you at the church office, just need prayer, need help. And so I said, okay. So she came up during the day and came in my office, and we sat and talked, and I just kind of made some space to listen. And on that day, I was thinking about this verse, actually, and this passage at that time. This was years ago. And I said, you know, as I've listened to you talk, like there's a lot about that you're struggling with that you've lost hope. You've lost purpose. And I said, here's what I'm going to challenge you to do for the next 7 days. Every single day, I want you to challenge yourself to do something to serve someone else. And be intentional about it. And so I said, every day we can text about it, and you can tell me what you've been doing. I'm going to just check on you to see what you're doing. And so on the first day, the only thing she could think of was when she made her kids lunch, she put a note in her kids' lunch to tell her kid how much she loved him and hoped that he had a good day. And so she said, that's what I did today to serve my son. And then the next day, it was that she sent a text to someone to tell them how much that person had meant to them and how much they had encouraged her in her dark times. And that person responded back and said, I can't believe you texted me today. I really needed to hear that. And then the next day, she took a friend to lunch and bought lunch for that friend and found out through that this person was going through a difficult time, and she was able to just be present and listen. And every day, she's sharing these stories about how her serving someone else, she said, it actually lifted my despair. Do you know why? It reminded her that she still had purpose. That God had something that he wanted to do with her life. That even as she was battling with this depression and anxiety, she learned in the midst of this, I can be a blessing and serve other people. I don't have to have it all together. I don't have to be anxiety-free. But God can help me to sell what I have and give what I have to bless other people. So maybe you're battling anxiety and depression. I know without any doubt that a message like this does not in any way wave a magic wand, biblical wand over your life, and you're going to walk out of here and never struggle with anxiety again. But can I just encourage you with this today? That in those moments of anxiety to remember what Jesus said here in Luke chapter 12. Trust me. I've got you. And seek my kingdom. Don't be worrying about all this stuff over here that the people that are not my kids are worried about. Seek my kingdom. And then do what you can to serve other people. Not saying you got to go out and sell everything you got to give to the needy. The principle is very clear. Serve Him by serving other people. And in that service, by giving to bless others and serving them in that way, you'll be reminded that God has something that He wants to do only through you. Would you stand with me today? I'll pray over us. And we want to create just a time to respond today as God leads in your heart. So I'll pray and then talk a little bit about that time. Father, thank you for your word. And I pray that I've presented it in a way that's pleasing to you. And I pray, Lord, that your word would go forth and accomplish your purposes and not ours. But I just want to pray over my church family, my friends here today, that maybe there are some who are just struggling with faith. Lord, I pray that your word today reminded them that you have them. And that their life is not measured by the accumulation of stuff. But our life's value is measured because you're our Father. And so I pray for those who might be struggling with faith that today they would know they can trust you. And maybe for some who are struggling with seeking the things of this world, the accumulation of stuff, that today they've heard from your word that they should seek your kingdom and that you'll meet every single need that they have. And then maybe others who are just in the midst of feeling anxiety and feeling like their life has no meaning and purpose. I pray you'll remind them today that if you love the birds and take care of them the way that you do, that they are infinitely more valuable to you. So valuable that you sent your son Jesus to die for them. And remind them today of who they are in you. And that God, you've called all of us to serve the needs of other people. And to build up wealth, not here, but in heaven, in the way that we live our lives. So I pray that you'll remind those who are struggling today of their value in your eyes, and that you want to use them and can use them if they'll surrender to you. Pray this in Jesus' name, amen.